Okay, welcome to the second but last regular session in this conference. I have a full-packed program, so I start right away, not waiting for people coming late from lunch. My name is Stefan Hermann, and this is actually the first talk in public that I give as a member of the company JK Software. So I should at least say a sentence about this company, about 500 employees. Providing integrated retail solutions. So in plain words, every piece of software that a supermarket or something like that could ever use in some integrated fashion. And being a tool enthusiast, I will be speaking about tools, of course, tools that I develop for that company. But on the one hand, I hope I can show sufficient technical content, but on the other hand, working for that company, just creating cool stuff is not sufficient. It has to deliver real productivity gain for the company. So I will have to speak about the stakeholders involved. And so try to bridge that gap between stakeholder issues and technical issues. And the tools that I'm developing are mostly DSL tools, and so there is quite a bit of Xtext in this. And so I like to emphasize the S in DSL because we've seen quite some talks about using Xtext for general purpose languages, which may be fine, but my focus is really at domain-specific languages. And what exactly do we mean by being specific with a language? I mean, we can, for example, create a language specifically for your domain objects, and then you can, if you understand that domain, it's pretty easy to create a domain-specific language for that. And from there, you can generate lots and lots and lots of code. And actually, when I started doing this, the company already had some tradition. And so when I mentioned Xtext, all they will be thinking is, oh, you mean the generator. So there's a common perception that using modeling tools is only about generating source code. I think this is not it. And my question is, if we want to do some of the source code generation, is that really the hard problems of this decade? And I don't think it is. I think the hard problems, the bottlenecks in real commercial software production always relate to some gaps and some borders that we have. Sometimes there may be gaps and borders between technologies, but more significantly, gaps and borders between people. So we need to speak about a little bit about what people. I won't say people are hard like in the keynote, but we have to consider them. And our discipline, for my belief, too much focuses on divide and conquer. We do it in the technology, and we do it with roles that people play in the company. What we are lacking is that after separating, we also need to integrate. And so for this talk, I want to use the two letters, the S from DSL. I want to mean specific separation, split it into different things, and I want to use the letter I as a symbol for integrating all this, for example, in an integrated development environment. So let me quickly walk through the different criteria and how we try to be specific with our DSL development. How specific exactly? How many languages do we want to develop? And I definitely don't speak just about one or two languages. It will be a big family of languages that we're using in this company. And the first obvious distinction is that, for example, a language that's specialized for defining domain objects is completely separate from a language that's specialized at defining the UI of an application, is completely separate from a language that's specialized in defining the flow or the process or the business process, or whatever you want to call it, or just call it the model and the view and the controller. These are distinctions that we're all familiar with, and writing a specific DSL for each of these is pretty common. And just want to mention, I'm not speaking about DSLs for writing your individual operations or actions or services, because from my perception, for this task, we already have a language that's good enough. It's not perfect, but using Java for the core behavior part for the individual things is good enough. I'm not speaking about doing everything only in DSLs. Java has its place here, but this is not all. In my perception, this is only the first of 3 dimensions how we can create a coordinate space for domain-specific languages. The second is actually the level of detail. A consultant has a completely different view on, for example, a domain model than a Java programmer has. And only the DB expert wants to talk about tables and joins and keys and all this. And still, they're talking about the same thing. So if we speak about a language for domain objects, do we want to put all that stuff into one language? Or shouldn't we rather provide one specific language for each of these stakeholders, even within the slice of speaking about domain objects, or about UIs, or about business processes? So level of detail, for me, is a reason to create a separation between DSLs. And last but not least, and this will make the technical meat of this presentation, using Xtext, we're initially only speaking about textual DSLs. And these languages are very good at certain tasks, but they are not used for all. They are not useful for all tasks that are necessary within a company. But already with these DSLs, we actually get more representations than just the text in a text buffer. We also get the representation as an outline tree view, or as a text hover, or a search result, etc., etc. So already a textual DSL with its IDE has a lot of representation, and it means that in specific contexts we can look at the model in different ways, which is great. But that's not enough. So there's lots of talk about graphical representations. For example, about this rare species of diagram editors. And every time I present my approach to certain people in the company, they will ask me, where's the graphical editor for all this? And do we want to develop graphical DSLs? My current answer, I will have to rethink that after Jan has completed what he showed in today's presentation to evolve to a framework. But from today's point of view, creating a graphical editor that is usable to the extent that it actually boosts the productivity of a developer is just too expensive. Creating a very good graphical editor, I cannot do in the time that I have. And I actually think with today's graphical editors, it actually distracts from the real work. People spend too much time trying to get a nice diagram instead of getting a great model. Much more affordable way is to speak about graphical visualizations after the fact, after you already have the model. And for most of the purposes in our companies, this is actually good enough and it's cool and works. So we're not having a graphical DSL, but we need graphical representations. And then the manager comes, and if I want to show him, we have all this great stuff in Eclipse, he says, no, I won't ever open Eclipse. I want a document. Where's the thing that I can print at the end of the day and sign, seal, deliver, and put on the shelf, etc.? So we need PDFs from our models. And speaking about documentation, there's another role in the company. They do not use DSLs, they use natural language. And this has to be integrated into this approach as well. But they not only use natural language, they use formatted natural language. Maybe there is a DSL for formatting natural language text. So these are the 3 dimensions, and this coordinate space is pretty densely populated actually in our company with lots of different DSLs. And moving from the separation to the integration part, because this is which is technologically interesting and also organizationally. First, integration in my context is about speaking about these people. They have their different responsibilities and their different skills, but all of them want to understand what's the model. They want to participate in shaping the model and shaping thereby the application. Most of them want to automate some of the boring stuff, but they need to communicate. And that's one of the greatest bottlenecks in what I perceive in companies. So let me briefly go through the dimensions and see what kind of integration between DSLs we can already support. In the dimension of different domains, like model, view, or control, we basically have 2 options for integrating DSLs. So we can basically include one DSL into the other. So in Xtext terminology, this would be grammar mix-ins, which is quite reasonable approach. And it will, of course, give the most powerful language, because then, while you write your UI, you can quickly, in the same document, add another domain object, and you can add another everything. So if you include all the language into one, it's, of course, most powerful. But that's exactly what I'm afraid of. It will be abused, and the separation between the different views, the different perspectives, will be lost. So I want to keep the different languages separated, but I want to connect them. So what I do in Xtext, I use this import model, so that in each of the language, I will be able to have cross-references into other languages, of course. And the first part is pretty easy. So for example, in a process model, I want to be able to refer to a type that's defined in a domain object model. That's standard. What's a little bit more surprising, in some situations, I need to be able to specialize a concept that's defined in one DSL and inherit from that and use it in another DSL. So we have cross-language inheritance, which works fine under the precondition that you actually manually maintain your models. And after prototyping phase where you generate, let the Xtext infer the models, you want to make them more stable and want to have more control over the models. But then even this cross-model inheritance works well, except the Xtext editor doesn't know it works. It flags some errors, but the generator is fine with this. So my common theme in this is I want to separate things. And I want to create connections, but I want to create connections between individual parts, not just merging everything into one. And the litmus test whether all this works is, for example, whether on each identifier in a DSL I can press F3, and even if it's going to a completely different document, it should take me to the declaration of this thing. So F3 is a litmus test for this connection. Along the next dimension of the different levels of details, the temptation is even bigger to say, okay, I want to include all these different views into one language. But here the problem is even bigger. If I say there's a view of a domain expert, there's a view of a Java developer and of a database specialist, and if all the details, the different people contribute to the model, would be merged into one model, the document would get huge. And actually, if I think about my stakeholders, it completely defeats the purpose of separation, because how can I let each stakeholder take responsibility for exactly those details that he is specialist for if everything is merged into one document? So this just doesn't serve the purpose. So again, we want to keep separate languages so that we have separate models with different views. And we want to see each layer of these languages as a refinement with respect to the previous. And there will be references between these layers. And in fact, to make it easy, I want that an element specified in the top layer has a name E1. I want the name E1 in the next layer to refer to the same thing plus some added details. And the common idiom in Xtext we use here, I don't know if this is approvable by Xtext team, it would be to mix the concept of something has a name, but the name is actually a cross-reference to the thing that has been defined in the upper layer. It works after you apply some tweaks to some of the providers and strategies. Some out-of-the-box concepts regarding the name feature do not work in this approach, but it can be made to work, and then it exactly meets my expectation to have these separate layers, and the same name refers to all the slices of an element that is stepwise refined. And here's a funny story with one of our product owners. For the first time, they realized if in this upper layer they change something in their model, they can actually break the build. They can create a bug. Because now they are actually responsible for something that will be part of the application proper. Previously, they only created Word documents, but Word documents cannot create a build failure. But now they have responsibility, but that's the goal, that each of those can have responsibility, and what they do is binding for the application, period. Litmus test F3 across these layers again. Regarding representation integration, let me try to start with the current situation, and I think it's not so uncommon. I mean, we're not in the Stone Ages anymore. The developer already has a DSL from a predecessor of mine, and inside that DSL there is some comments like javadoc, and this is what will go into the documentation in the at the end of the day. But the specifier, guess what kind of representation he uses? Of course, Microsoft Word. And of course, there's a relation between that document and the other document, and the current technique to use that is, of course, to copy-paste snippets from the Word document into the DSL, and from there on we're safe. But this copy-paste is one of those barriers where there's no information flow back and forth, and so this is one of the bottlenecks we want to address. It's a bottleneck because people are working on different representation of the same information. And that's exactly where one of the little tweaks that I programmed seems to help surprisingly well. The understanding is, of course, that a specifier or product owner is now the new name, and the developer should work on a common model and have a shared thing that they're working on. And for the developer, it's clear with the DSL they can directly contribute to that model. But what input could a product owner who's not a developer provide that goes directly into that model? And we try to do very, very simple stuff. So what we're using here as a replacement of Microsoft Word is simply wiki syntax. And they're fine with that. They use from that from wikis from all kinds of systems they're already using. And they can put it into the same model. And the question, which other projects have also addressed, has to be addressed again, is how do we connect these two representations, a textual DSL with a formal grammar, etc., and not quite as formal document written in wiki syntax. We do the simplest thing that could possibly work here. Do the simplest thing, yep. And the integration will, of course, be done using Eclipse, and specifically, I'm using a technology called Object Themes. Somebody may have expected this, if you know me. So, what does it look like? The simplest thing that could possibly work to let a developer and a product owner work on the same model is to have an IDE where you have a DSL view on top, and you have a wiki view at the bottom, and you have an outline that will kind of be used for connecting these. DSL, business as usual. Wiki, we use a Mylyn WikiText plugin, specifically with MediaWiki syntax. We declared a new document type with extension doc, for example. There's several instances of this technology. And, wow, the product owner can actually have spell checking in their part of the model, whereas the developer doesn't want any spell checking in his document. It just gets in his face and he doesn't know what to do, because developers cannot spell anyway. We want to use the outline to connect, and this actually was the first experience of mine where I was happy to have E4 underneath, because for this kind of integration, I definitely need to be able to put editors into different view stacks in a perspective. Cool, E4 has an advantage. Here's a new requirement, and this is actually one of the driving forces in this game. Documentation must be translatable. So our company sits in Germany and Czech Republic, and so at least German, Czech, and English have to be supported in documentation. How do we create the same model in 3 different languages? Well, after splitting the model from its documentation already, it's pretty easy to just add another view with another WikiText file. And the interesting thing will be, how do we synchronize these things? But basically, now and since translating documentation is a separate responsibility in the company, it's very helpful to have a view where you have the different languages side by side, so you can look what's written in language A and write the translation in language B side by side. So how do we integrate these very different representations. I mean, WikiText is not a real DSL, and we cannot use Xtext for that part. So doing the simplest thing that could possibly work, we start with defining structural equivalence or correspondence. At the file level, there's directories for each of the languages that we want to use, and there's a name equivalence of the file names, except for the extension. And inside the documents, we again do the simplest thing that could possibly work. A model tree is directly mapped to a tree of headings in the WikiText syntax. And by using the same names, the tools can understand which part of the documentation refers to which part of the model. And in order to support translation, we have the split. Only what's in parentheses in the heading is a reference to the model, and the other part is a translatable heading. So we have, with no invention at all, the possibility to link a WikiText to a model. But how does it really work? I mean, how do we keep those things in sync? And of course, there's projects that have some automation for keeping different views in sync. But actually, I was kind of scared and whether this would be too much magic. And in fact, it would not work in our setting because the different representations are under separate ownership. The product owner only owns the documentation view. The developer only owns the model view representation. So if I make a change in one of these, I'm not even allowed to propagate it automatically to the other view. So the low-cost solution to this is just an approach to a validation, which goes across a DSL document plus the WikiText and checks whether everything matches. And if a document doesn't have, a model doesn't have any documentation at all, we have a quick fix to just add a skeleton documentation. And if it has a documentation file, but only some of the nodes are missing, we have individual warnings and quick fixes to just add, or we should also have quick fixes for removing. So quick fixes for just individually repairing any structural mismatches between these models. And speaking of warnings, I tend to make everything configurable in this context so that before a release of the product, I can make sure we turn the warning to error so that we can make sure that no release will ever be shipped where the documentation is out of sync with the product, period. But how does it really work? I mean, so this is some structural correspondence, and you have some quick fixes. This is no rocket science. What's the usability of this? How do you work with an IDE that has these separate views? And so my idea was to simply, there's these 4 views, DSL and the outline and to WikiText. I want to synchronize these in terms of wherever I put the focus, all the other 3 views should follow the focus to show the representation of the same element. And so instead of opening a property dialog or something, if it's all available immediately and in sync, I think it should not be a big barrier to work with this. So first of all, there's a little button. So if you only have the DSL file, you can open the corresponding documentation. And then the first funny thing is, if you click into a WikiText buffer, of course, the Mylyn WikiText plugin will show the Mylyn WikiText outline. So how can we use just one outline to coordinate 2 or 3 editors? The first thing we had to do is simply tell the Mylyn plugin to stop using its own outline. And that's something that's kind of unusual to tell some plugin not to do what it's usually doing. And then on top of that, we had to introduce some notification back and forth. So n-way selection listener, and also whenever a change is made in one of these files, this may affect the warnings that are shown in the DSL. So we also need an n-way revalidation strategy and notification. So once we have the WikiText, how can we consume it? Of course, Mylyn WikiText plugin has a nice preview, but also when working with the DSL, I want to see the documentation as well, and so the developer using the DSL doesn't even have to open the WikiText editor. He can see the documentation immediately in the text harbor, which is possible because Mylyn WikiText is able to translate into HTML, and text harbors can display HTML, so we can display the original formatted documentation directly in place, which is, I think, as small as technology as it is, it's a great usability improvement. Next, the Java code generation will, of course, pull in the WikiText snippets into the Java classes as Java docs, so that when we run the Java doc overall generation, it will include those things not only from the DSL model, but also from WikiText. And at the end of the day, to make the manager happy and the product owner, yes, we have document generation, and document generation at the end of the day will include all the representations that are relevant. At this point, it's only the model and the documentation. And as an intermediate format for this, I chose DocBook. I could have chosen LaTeX for this purpose, but DocBook is pretty well suited to make a clear separation. So what I generate is just the semantic and structural content. And now I give this to the product owner, and the product owner is much better able than I am. This is just an ugly draft. The product owner can now apply style sheets on this DocBook and make it the printable document that's exactly needed in terms of the corporate identity of the company, and looks nice, nicer than I could make it. Yeah, but how do you really make this? So here's the technical challenge in all this. There's two frameworks. Xtext is not really prepared to interact with WikiText. Xtext may be prepared to talk to some other plugins, especially in JDT, but Xtext doesn't know about WikiText, and WikiText, even worse, is not expecting to interact with anybody. Why should they? So we have two frameworks. They each have their assumptions, and a combination of these two is not possible. And so this is a Friday, let's say, and I'm in my office, and I say, integrating these technologies would be a cool feature. I want to show this to my boss on next Monday. This is Friday. I want to do this now. I don't go submit bug reports to Mylyn WikiText to insert some hooks so that I could make this. I need it now. So what I do the adaptation my way. Here I use technology called object teams. And some people may think of what I'm doing now, modifying the behavior of other plugins, as cheating. I'm fine if they say I'm cheating, but I'm very proud to do this cheating with style. So this is something that I'm actually proud to show. It's not something I want to sweep under the carpet. So object teams is very tightly integrated with Equinox, and so in each plugin project, you have to declare which other plugins can be adapted by this plugin. So I'm very open about this. Only these plugins can be adapted from here. And inside, we reference what we call a team class, which is a module, a container for the individual adaptations. And the real music is in the role classes. That's a concept I need to say a few words about, which is kind of a mechanism for externally extending something that's in another plugin, for example. Like inheritance, but inheritance between objects. This again follows my theme of separate but connected. Even these implementations are separate, and I don't have to screw with that implementation, and they don't have to know about my implementation. But at runtime, all this will be connected. More precisely, at weave time, we will weave some hooks onto the other side, and then even at runtime, I can enable or disable, activate, deactivate my adaptations dynamically. So here's a 101 programming object teams just in one slide. It's as easy as this. You have a row class, and instead of saying extends class blah blah blah, I say played by. So here I'm in the course of prohibiting that Xtext creates two controls for this outline, because of some funny control flows may lead Xtext to the understanding that it still has to create a control, although somebody else may have already done this. So that's a use case. And so we bind a new class to the existing outline page. In this class, we create a binding between methods. And this kind of binding that we're using here has the flavor of replacing. Think actually as overriding. I'm overriding a method from that other class. Here's a little detail. There's another predicate. But basically, that's all I need. And the implementation of the role method that's bound is just an empty body. So this tiny little script piece of code already does suppress some of the behavior of Xtext, which we had to do. Slightly more involved example was doing one of the refresh things where we had to intercept some method calls, but just replacing a method with a null empty implementation didn't suffice. We wanted to make some changes inside some method body. And so if I would use aspect-J, I would try to capture this exact expression within a method body. But that's pretty fragile, actually. A much more robust situation is just copy that method into your role class and make slight changes inside. So this works, but isn't that a maintenance nightmare? And in order to make this maintainable, we have a very, very simple action feature in our tool where we can simply say at any point in time, I want to compare my current version of this method with the original version of that method. And so I see in a compare editor that indeed here is an area of code that I have replaced just with an empty thing with just a comment marking that I don't want this particular piece of behavior, and everything else is clean. So I know no changes have occurred on the base side, so my adaptation is still valid for what it's trying to do. So that's my answer to maintainability. If you copy like 20 lines of code, that's not really that big a problem. Summarizing what we did with object teams in this context, with just less than 300 lines of code, I actually made 100% feature implementation of the integration I wanted, with using just one outline to control 3 different editors. It does exactly what it wants. So I don't like making compromises regarding functionality. So that's where object teams is really fantastic. There's no barriers. You can do everything. And I could speak about build issues. It's pretty much standard. By now, object teams had to do some catching up, but it works really standard right now. Previously, I used the same technology to do some hot fixes of some bugs in Xtext, for example. So if I could not upgrade to a newer version or the bug fix was not actually available, but still it was already known how to fix the bug, I could simply place a role on top of that Xtext class if this is not adaptable via changing the injection, and just as an intermediate solution, put a role on top of and apply bug fixes via that. And I'm happy if the bug is in the original Xtext, I simply pull out that role and then I can consume the original solution. Challenges and pain points. I could speak about some of the pitfalls that I had. The main pitfall in my case was only build issues. That's the hugest time sink in all this. And if you look at the list of technologies that I have to use to just make one build, it's just too much. But let's very, very briefly check whether we have met all the requirements of our stakeholders. That's the goal. So the product owner, regarding the domain object model, is actually quite happy with what we have, with the DSL and then refinement of the DSL and with the documentation, etc. But for the next model, there's still open issues, because if we want to look at the process model, and if we want to let all these stakeholders cooperate, a product owner and an interaction designer creates a UI and a tester, if they all want to speak about the same process model, they want something graphical. And so what I did here is just in one screenshot, I integrated Jan's GraphView prototype framework from 2.5 years ago, I think, which simply gives live graphical visualization of the model that you see on the left-hand side. And it turns out that with GraphView and Mylyn underneath, this is exactly the kind of visualization that helps get an overview of what is this process about, and this is a perfect match for what we need here. Maybe with next generation graphical editors we can do differently, but so having all these three representations together and integrated is perfect. Summary and status of this is for some stakeholders we are done, we're fine, and they actually get actively involved. For product owners, testers, we still have to do some convincing, some persuasion, and creating maybe a few more representations. But at the end, yes, we have a lot of different DSLs, and each DSL focuses on one task. And when you work with that DSL, it helps you focus on this particular task. But all these DSLs are connected. And I think each of these DSLs, where two different stakeholders can read and write this syntax, helps to overcome one of the gaps and one of the bottlenecks in our companies. And so it really helps for the communication between the stakeholders in our company. So this is work in progress, but it's gaining great attraction right now. And so this is some, let me conclude with just some statistics, which I don't have to read to you, and the cast of all the involved technologies, etc., blah, blah, blah. So that's a huge stack of things. But the main message is, with all these frameworks, it's actually possible single-handedly. It's just me driving this in this 500-people company, roll it out into all the departments and make it work and help integrate people. And starting catch on fire here. Thanks for listening. Do we have time for one question? If there's a question? Or you catch me afterwards, or ask. So one question I have is whether or not there's interest in like open sourcing examples for this particular kind of WikiText Xtext integration. I know it's not rocket science. I can just can report that for our use cases it really helped. Currently all this is proprietary development, but there is willingness, if there's interest in some of these integration aspects, that some of this could be open sourced. So if there's interest, just speak to me or email me or something.